Welcome back to another edition of the MintCast by Mint Press News, a news service dedicated to watchdog journalism that holds the powerful to account and goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories the corporate media don't want you to see. Today, Whitney Webb and myself are joined by Matt Kennard from the Latin American Bureau in London. Matt was previously a reporter for the Financial Times and has written for The Guardian, New York Times, and Mother Jones. He's the co-author of the new book, or the old book, Irregular Army, How the US Military Recruited Neo-Nazis, Gang Members, and Criminals to Fight the War on Terror. Just as a disclosure, I was editor of his chapter in my latest book, The Propaganda Model in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent, which is scheduled for release May 14th.
And Matt also broke the news story of the attempt by Alan Dershowitz to attempt to suppress the publication of Norman Finkelstein's book, Beyond Chutzpah. But it is his 2015 work, The Racket, A Rogue Reporter versus the Masters of the Universe, published by Zed, that we are going to be talking about first today. So after 4 years traversing the globe for the Financial Times, Matt saw how the world truly worked, how he claims it is controlled by a racket, and that racket, of course, includes the media. The title is a reference to Major General Smedley Butler's famous War is a Racket for Big Business speech. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Matt, I found your book, The Racket, really engrossing when I first picked it up, and I'm clearly not the only one. The endorsements of the cover is like a who's who of journalism. Greg Palast, Owen Jones, Naomi Klein, Mike Davis, Noam Chomsky. That's pretty impressive. Could you just give us an overview about your book and what you found while working at the FT?
Yeah, I guess The Racket is best described as a work which filled in the blanks from what I saw at the Financial Times. So it's using a lot of the reporting I did at the Financial Times, but telling the real story, because at the Financial Times you can only tell one part of the story. And I was there for 2.5 years, and I had access to all the major power players in the world. I was in Washington, DC, so I had access to the political class there, but I also traveled extensively and had access to high officials in the World Bank, IMF, other people. So as I was going along, I kind of had in the back of my mind that I would eventually leave. So I should use the access I had at that time to get as much information as possible to then write a book, which ended up as The Racket after I left. So basically what the book tried to do was try to puncture all the liberal myths that we're inundated with every day through our media about how the world works, which is essentially they're ideological myths. They're myths that are propagated to legitimize a system of exploitation and obfuscate it and make it look like a system which is fair and democratic. So it started, for me, the case that was, there were two cases that really, I think, explained for me how the system works. One was Haiti and one was Bolivia. Bolivia was interesting because I went there, it was 3 years after Evo Morales was elected president. But what Evo Morales was trying to do in Bolivia was trying to extricate Bolivia from this system that I'm talking about, a system of financial capitalism, which is set up to make the 1% richer. And what was really interesting about Bolivia was, I think in countries when you're looking at governments and administrations that are trying to extricate themselves from the system, you can learn a lot about the system itself, because you learn about the pressure points. Mm-hmm. You learn about how they enforce the system, which you can't really understand until someone stands up to it. You're seeing something similar in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. I think I understand, and I think a lot of people understand the system in the UK a lot better. Now we have a prime minister who wouldn't let it run as it has been running for however many centuries. But anyway, in Bolivia, what that opened up for me was mainly, it was US agencies I was looking at that were basically trying to stifle what and still is a liberation government, which was so USAID, the CIA, National Endowment for Democracy, there's this whole host of acronyms, which basically is an empire of acronyms. And all these agencies are in Bolivia, and and have been for a long time, saying, "Oh, we're here to help civil society. We're here to help democracy, and we're here to help human rights," and all the useful language. And essentially, it's Orwellian to the extent that it's literally the opposite of the truth. That if you look into it, that what actually Evo did by kicking out the DEA and kicking out USAID was actually allow Bolivia to be sovereign and independent for the first time, possibly in its history. And for that, he was in 2008. It was very close to him being overthrown, because there was a massive strike and protest in the east where the rich white elite live, and it was touch and go. Obviously, he's in a much more stable position now, but it was really touch and go. And so what I saw there with these different agencies, with whatever was doing, really alerted me to the fact that if you, as Hugo Chavez famously said, look, I don't have a problem with the United States, but if you want to do what I'm doing, it makes a problem with the United States. And that's the point, is that you can't actually try and create a more civilized, a more democratic, and more human rights enhancing country without stepping on the toes of the United States. And actually, that's the other thing, that the book focuses on the US because the US is the major counter-revolutionary force in the world. Everywhere I went, it was the US as the main government and the main force behind all these movements which are trying to create a fairer and juster world. Obviously, the US, there's other international multilateral bodies like the World Bank and IMF, but essentially they're all controlled by the US anyway. So the US is the real heart of the empire. Right. But obviously, working in the Financial Times, you don't get to say what I just said. So the articles I was sending back, I didn't write sort of super propaganda for the empire, but I was very aware of what you can and can't say. So I'd pitch stories which were about the investment climate, where I would evaluate for investors how risky. I mean, essentially, a lot of foreign reporting for the Financial Times is their reports for investors to let them know if it's a risky investment. So I did a lot of that, but I interviewed a lot of people along the way that I didn't never use the interviews for the Financial Times, but I knew that I'd use them subsequently. So what you see in the racket is a culmination of all that work, and hopefully it explains in a quite an ambitious way how the system works, and how the real, on a really granular level, how the agencies, and I think there's been a lot of work done in an academic sense about US imperialism. But what I wanted to do was kind of do the investigative journalism side of it. So actually really go to the ground and talk to people who are affected by the US empire, and also people within the US empire, because I interviewed as I said, I got access to tons of people. So I got kind of both sides of the story to that extent. And the racket was the result of that.
Great. Okay. So the Financial Times is known for being one of those papers that often gets, exclusive access to events that are hosted by the global financial elite, like Davos being an example, or the World Economic Forum, its official name, right? So, and having peeked into this elite world that's mostly hidden from public view, are there any oligarchs or powerful figures that wield considerable influence in this racket that you describe in your book that may not be well known to the public, that are sort of hidden from view?
I wouldn't say there's any particular individuals I discovered that were exerting control that we don't know about. I mean, obviously they exist, but it was the institutions themselves which I was looking at, and the institutions have all sorts of individuals within them. A lot of them aren't even aware of the real goals of their institutions, which is why it was quite funny interviewing them, because they all parrot the ideological pieties that they're taught to when they enter the institution, which I think they really do believe it, because that's how they get up in the morning. But essentially all these institutions are the embodiment of the empire. They're all set up by a rich elite to enhance and promote their interests. It doesn't get much more complex than that. And I think that when you start looking into individuals, and I mean, there's obviously this anti-Semitism scandal in the UK, which is 99% rubbish. But there are, on the left, some sort of cranky elements that do try and pin capitalism on a couple of individuals or a couple of groups, which I think it's not as mysterious as that. There's a whole confluence of different organizations and people that all have the same interests, which is to gut social services. That they all have the same ideology because they all have the same interests. So I wouldn't say it was any particular individual.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I suppose reading your book, one of your main claims is that, like, far from being a bastion of freedom, being in the mainstream media is in fact very difficult because it's a tightly controlled place where journalists are pre-selected for their obedience, and those that don't fit the system, like yourself, in terms of political outlook, kind of constantly have to fight to even continue to be employed. Do you want to expand on that? Can you tell us about your experience working inside newsrooms with, like, editorial pressures or just groupthink or the ideology of the newsroom or your colleagues? Or yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I know you've done a lot of work on the propaganda model by Chomsky and Herman, and I had read that before I entered the Financial Times, but I think they essentially got that right. They got it right, and it's a cultural thing. Is that by the time you enter a place like the Financial Times or even the Guardian or wherever it is, you will have been selected to get there. That it's very rare that people will get through the different obstacles on the way to those kind of institutions without thinking certain things. So I got in because I didn't give too much away in the interview, and I really destroyed my reputation enough that they could have found out. But I think most people, before they get into somewhere like the Financial Times or the Guardian, they would already, obviously, when you're inside and you start trying to say those things, or you think things that are outside of the groupthink of the institution, it becomes difficult for you. And it's quite insidious because, as Chomsky and Herman say, it's a form of mind control, which is, it's not obvious. There's certain sort of, I'd say, tics that journalists have. So you will, if a negative force is backed by Iran, you will say Iran backed. But if a negative force is backed by the US, you won't say US backed. And no one's told you to say that. But if you're in that environment the whole time, and the paper you're reading every day, and everyone around you it has those verbal tics, you just end up repeating them without thinking, and then it becomes a real jolt if you suddenly talk about Egypt, the dictator there, and start putting US back before it. You just it's weird. You wouldn't do it. You don't think it. So I did think it, and I did write those sort of things. So I kind of did test it in that extent. And for example, with Mubarak, I was there in the Arab Spring, and I would often write US-backed Egyptian dictator, and it would actually get excised by the editor. They'd take it out and then say it wasn't relevant. It wasn't relevant to the story. Yeah. So I mean, but that's the funny thing, that it's like with that Rosa Luxemburg phrase: those who aren't moving don't notice their chains.
Right.
So corporate media, the journalists do think they're free because no one's telling them what they can't write, but that's because they never write anything that their editors don't want to. Their editors need to edit in an ideological sense because they're not testing the edges of the corporate media at all. So my time there really made me understand that essentially the propaganda model is correct. There's a very tight ideological system in place in the corporate media that does really not buck any dissent, really. I mean, was it, Alan, was it your article in Fair recently about how there wasn't one commentator in the whole of the US that wasn't backing the military coup?
No, that wasn't me. That was Teddy Ostro, but it's a really amazing...
It was a great article.
Information.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you have that kind of conformity in a country of 300 million people, it's insane. That's insane. And that is in inverted commas, a free media system. So no one's the irony. It's not a totalitarian system where the media's journalists are being told what to think. It's just that's how people implicitly understand that's how you get to be a journalist in the United States, and it's the same in the UK. And in fact, I have to say, it wasn't just the Financial Times that taught me this. It was also going to Columbia Journalism School in New York, which is kind of like the elite journalism school in the States, and also just a breeding ground for the next generation of corporate media journalists. And it was the same thing. It was complete. I went to Leeds University in England, which is not it's not a highly respected university at all, and I found much more interesting intellectual debate and much more diversity of opinion there than I did. It just got more and more narrow the higher I went up in the sort of ideological chain. So, and that's how it works. It selects, and it's not that it's quite a hard thing to analyze because it's not a totalitarian system, so you can't analyze anyone telling people how to write or how to think. But it's a system that works by just incentivizing certain ideological positions, and you end up with a media where you have not one journalist who opposes what is an outrageous coup against the democratic government in Venezuela.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I find that kind of the same in university as well. I mean, I'm from a relatively modest background, and I went to quite an elite university, Edinburgh, and I was kind of interested in politics, but I always got the sense that it wasn't for me, you know. So I went once to the Politics Society, and it was all these like 19, 20-year-olds. It was just totally full of those sorts of people who wear tweed jackets with leather patches. And I went to a talk by a Blairite spin doctor, and it was supposed to be about assessing Tony Blair's legacy. And very naively, I thought that we would all be talking about like, yeah, let's, you know, take him to The Hague, etc. But the entire hour was just spent by him talking about how he'd brilliantly captured the center ground. And then all the questions and answers from these very elite students were just total softballs. They were just talking about, you know, what was Blair's, how brilliant Blair was to, you know, like capture the common man, etc. So I definitely think it's not just in the media, but it's more just in public life as well.
It's any institution which has a bearing on public opinion. It has to be tightly controlled in an ideological sense, I believe. And that's what, and obviously the elite universities show less diversity because the people that end up in the elite in terms of the media and university settings often come out of the elite universities. So they focus more on controlling them. I mean, I totally had the same experience as you described there. Like Henry Kissinger came to Columbia Journalism School, and it was nuts. People were just saying to, like, literally asking, what's your favorite color? What do you think of the human rights abuses in China? Okay. And people wouldn't even. It's not because they're. I mean, I don't think none of them were particularly brave, but I think none of them actually knew anything about what he'd done because they'd watched CNN and he'd been introduced as this sort of elder statesman who was a genius in terms of international relations and foreign policy thinking. And it was obviously, that's rubbish. They don't know anything about Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. So, or Chile. I mean, the whole Bangladesh. I mean, there's a whole list of countries who were destroyed thanks to him. And in the end, I said, "How do you sleep at night, Dr. Kissinger?" And he replied, "What do you like?" You know, in his like comic book villain voice. He said, "What are you talking about?" So I said a couple of things like Chile, and I said all these different things, and he said, "I don't know what you've been reading on the internet." But then the dean of the school came up behind
on the internet, right?
Yeah, the dean of the school came up behind him and basically stopped me and put his hand up, and then I left. But then a week after, my professor came up to me and said, "I heard you disgraced yourself last week," and that's the kind of what they, because the professors there were the same. They all went through the same university system. They all understand implicitly what you have to believe or the people you have to revere to keep your elite positions. It's quite standard stuff. So the Financial Times kind of really made that clear in my mind. But the process of understanding how this elite ideological system works started at Columbia University. Definitely didn't start at Leeds, where it was much more vibrant debate, and I actually learned a lot more about politics there.
Mm. Well, speaking about Kissinger and how the Columbia didn't really hold him to account for any of his past crimes. There's sort of this sense in corporate media that, like, for example, we saw this a lot with like Russiagate reporting in the U.S. How there were a lot of stories, some of which were like just fabricated completely, and there was no accountability for that. Do you think the same sort of groupthink sort of rewards even really poor reporting, even if it's in service to U.S. empire, and doesn't really hold people accountable?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the whole part of the system is also these institutions confer intellectual respect. So if you say you're a Financial Times journalist, or you say you work for the Times or the Guardian, then you have this instant, you're seen as legitimate. Whereas people like us, who work for Mint Press News, or we're not seen as legitimate. And that's part of the whole system as well. That pushes people away from saying anything out of the ordinary, because you'll be seen as fringe, you'll be seen as a crank. I mean, you know all the terms that they'll call people who don't.
Oh yeah.
But that's not related to reality. That's related to controlling the ideological environment. So what that means is these people who are seen as legitimate journalists and really intelligent come out of absolutely batshit crazy ideas. Like the Russiagate stuff is similar. But also, if you see any war starting, they parrot all the propaganda, which is conspiracy nonsense. It's no different from real cranky stuff. They're like weapons of mass destruction. Same thing. So I think that the mainstream media is full of cranks and full of people who have no bearing on reality, but because the way the system's set up, they're conferred with this respect, and it does come crashing down every now and then. And I think Russiagate is an example of that. I think Matt Taibbi wrote an article saying Russiagate is QAnon for journalists. I think it's really accurate. You know? It's like there's no difference. It's just that one is like some little cell in a cell of internet nutters, and one is our mainstream media.
Yeah, well, talking about the mainstream media and current events, I mean, you dedicated your book to Chelsea Manning, who's been in the news quite a lot, somebody who's done almost more than anyone to expose how the game works. She's just been sent back to prison for her refusal to testify against WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange. And of course, Assange himself just made world headlines after British police entered the Ecuadorian embassy, arrested him, and as we record now, he's in Belmarsh prison, and there's widespread speculation that he'll be extradited to the US. I know you've got a lot to say about Manning and Assange. What do you think about their predicament?
Well, it's a disgrace, firstly, that either of them are in prison. But it's not surprising, because they really did, as you mentioned, reveal how the world works in a way that had never been done before. And the US and any other country that gets their inner workings revealed in that kind of way want to send a message that you can't do this. So, and in the case of Assange, what happens with him is massively important for any journalist that wants to practice and do real journalism in the next however many years, because even the case that's been brought against him, that's for literally protecting his source, which happens all the time, and conferring with his source about what information to get. And as a journalist, you know that when you're talking with sources, I mean, there's two parts to it. One is, during the whole of the Obama administration, there was always talk about how they would get Assange because he was protected under the First Amendment, and there was often talk that the conversations he was having with Manning would be the mechanism through which they could get him. But even the Obama administration apparently decided that it wasn't strong enough to bring a case. But the Trump administration have brought this case now and said that the conversations with Manning and the attempts to hack a password, which were unsuccessful, or apparently unsuccessful, form the basis. For me, I mean, if that's set down as a precedent, it endangers every investigative journalist practicing and using sources within the state or within any other institution. Because yes, apart that you have to be slightly tech savvy to do what they were doing, but there's all sorts of conversations that go on between sources and journalists all the time about what information, firstly, that journalists want, secondly, what sources have, and thirdly, about what sources could have if they went into certain areas. So, and the problem we have is that journalists, we don't have the mainstream media, we don't have journalists that actually practice journalism, so they don't see the threat. So for them, they would happily toss Assange to the dogs because it probably won't impact on them, because none of them do anything that the state doesn't want anyway. The really worrying thing is that this will set a precedent that anyone who's doing things that powerful forces don't want you to do, they'll then have a precedent with which they can bring the journalist to book as well as the source, because obviously the source has always been the one at risk in this kind of process. And what happened to Manning was awful, but much more expected and much more in line with what America and other powers have done when their information has been leaked. But the Assange case is really, really important, because the other thing they're trying to do is say, well, Assange isn't a journalist. That's what the way they're going to get around it. And that's been parroted by places like The Economist and other places as well. that he's a hacker. But in fact, he's the definition of a journalist. He's revealed lots and lots of information that powerful forces don't want revealed in public interest. And they've tried to say he's an agent of Russia and all these other things. But essentially, none of that's been proved. And the only thing that is on record is that he's revealed all this information. So personally, it's a worry for any journalist practicing what happens. I don't know what will happen with the case, because I would have thought in theory that Assange would have a good chance of not being extradited to the US after the Lori Love case. But then again, it's so highly politicized, this case already. And in his first appearance in court, the judge called him a narcissist, which was completely out of line and out of any kind of legal etiquette for that kind of thing. And then I think the next one, the judge said he'd been charged in Sweden on these rape allegations, which was untrue. So the next judge actually got a fact wrong. So the idea that he's going to get a fair trial in the UK, I think, is kind of becoming more and more unlikely. So we'll have to see. Hopefully, public opinion is very important in this case, because and powerful forces are aware of this, which is why so much misinformation and disinformation is put out there, and they try and endlessly move the issue away from press freedom and First Amendment and all the other principles we should be interested in, and try and push it towards the Sweden case, or try and push it towards the fact he's a hacker and he's not a journalist. There's all these different mechanisms that the powerful forces are trying to use to obfuscate and obscure the fact that actually, in essence, there's a journalist that is currently in prison, that is potentially going to be extradited to the US and maybe put in prison for the rest of his life, purely for revealing secrets of the US national security state in the public interest.
So something I want to bring up really quick, you were talking about how the US indictment that we know of, at least anyway, would have really troubling precedent, would set a really troubling precedent for journalism in general. But a lot of people have also brought up the fact that it's really likely that Assange, if he is extradited, would then be sort of subjected to further indictments. For example, the Mueller report, when that was really sort of suggested that there was like an Espionage Act case in the works against Assange. Is there anything you'd like to say about the potential predicament for journalism that those other indictments could potentially cause?
Yeah, I think first thing to say is I think that's highly likely. There's also this other document which came out recently, which was a request from the FBI to interview Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who was the co-founder of WikiLeaks, I think, but eventually fell out with Assange, but was around when he was talking to Manning. And in that request for an interview, the same thing, they hinted heavily that there was another case which involved the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act is an antiquated, really draconian act, which should not...
It's almost 100 years old, I think.
Exactly. So. And used against people that have nothing to do with espionage. And lots of whistleblowers under Obama, as you know, more whistleblowers than every single administration previous to him were prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Yeah, if it's used against a journalist, that will set an awful precedent. And I imagine it will be, because the idea that they'll get Assange to the US and put him in prison for 5 years or less just seems ridiculous. Once they've got him, they're going to throw the book at him, and they want to send a message, because there's always going to be leakers, and leakers know what their risks are. There's long history of leakers being put in prison or nearly being put in prison. Ellsberg was another case. He actually got off, obviously, but there has never been, apart from Assange, a journalist put in prison for writing about secrets that they've got through sources. And that is, in the information age, that is a real chink in the armor of the national security state, that journalists can do this. So they really, really want to criminalize investigative journalism when it comes to national security, because it's a massive threat to them. And in fact, the UK government itself they were recommended to pass a law, it hasn't happened yet, which would criminalize the possession of classified information if you haven't got the status to possess it, which would obviously criminalize journalists. And I think this is the next move we're going to see, is leakers themselves are already criminalized. The journalists who received that information, they're going to try and criminalize them too. And I think Assange could be the canary in the coal mine when it comes to that. So and also the other thing with Assange, they can hit him with all this stuff because he's so hated on the whole that the people that should defend him on principle won't do it. So we'll see what happens.
So, as you mentioned, the mainstream media has been, overwhelmingly supportive of the arrest. I mean, of Assange's arrest. So we had, the Washington Post calling it long overdue. Comedy shows in the U.S. like Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show just mocked him. They called him like an internet troll and and all this stuff. And we're really aimed at dehumanizing a man that's basically for the past year been in what a lot of people have likened to solitary confinement. Are you surprised by this reaction at all? And what do you think this says about the mainstream media as a whole?
I'm not really surprised. I mean, as you said before, no one in the history of journalism has ever exposed the powerful in the way that Assange has and WikiLeaks has. So, of course, you're going to come under concerted attack from every side. And the media, far from being a check on power, is often an accomplice. So all the propaganda that's been put out by national security officials, government officials, has been parroted endlessly by the media. And that goes across the political spectrum as well, because probably the worst demonizers of Assange have been The Guardian, who were previously his journalistic partners, and they benefited hugely from his journalism and his leaks, and they then turned on a dime and became his biggest accusers, and obviously even publishing completely fake stories like that story about Manafort going to the embassy 3 times for meetings. So in this day and age, I'm not surprised that he's been so heavily dehumanized. It is awful to see because there's no sympathy on a human level for him. I mean, if you can look at the pictures of him being dragged out of that embassy and not feel some sort of not find them distressing, then there's a problem that you've eaten up all the propaganda about him, which has basically been set up to dehumanize him. That he doesn't have feelings. That he's not a legitimate target for sympathy. So I think it's awful. I think that it's really problematic because if you're trying to devise a media campaign or a campaign to support him now, there's hardly any parts of civil or the mainstream that are actually in support of him as a publisher. So I think it's a disgraceful indictment of the mainstream media. I think it's an indictment of journalists, and I think it's an indictment of all of us that we aren't out on the streets every day, because if he is, it's been said before, but he is the canary in the coal mine. If they get Assange, then they can get all of us. Right.
I mean, obviously, it's no coincidence that Julian Assange chose a South American country like Ecuador as a means of refuge. I mean, you've traveled to a lot of these countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, and reported on them for the Financial Times and other places. A lot of these countries in Latin America have gone through a profound political change in the last 20 years or so and have openly challenged what you call the rackets. What do you make of these countries?
Well, I think it's massively inspiring what has happened in Latin America. And obviously at this juncture, we're at a time when a lot of that progress is being rolled back. But the case of Ecuador providing asylum to Assange is actually a good example of what happened in what's called the pink tide. It wasn't, I mean, obviously it was a political process and it was left-wing governments, but what it was an independence movement. That's what people don't understand. It's about, politics is obviously involved, but essentially those countries were colonies of the United States. Or at least not neo-colonies. There was a new system, but no president, no prime minister would do anything that went against US dictates. And the process in the process of liberation under Morales and Lula and Correa, they became independent countries, a lot of them for the first time. And Assange being granted asylum was one of the biggest signs of that, because you had a journalist who was being persecuted for revealing the secrets of the US, and the Correa administration came under huge amounts of pressure in terms of subversion by the CIA, but also threats using multilateral institutions to withdraw loans and to punish them economically, and they withstood it all. And Lenin comes in, Lenin Moreno, who succeeded Correa and was actually his deputy, and has instantly reintegrated Ecuador into that whole US-based system. And part of that has been getting those IMF loans. Part of that has been handing Assange over for revealing war crimes and secrets of the US. So I think what it shows is two things. One is that the potential for another way of doing things is possible. The other is that you will come under concerted and often violent attack by the United States and its local lackeys. And the third thing is, if you want to have a left-wing movement like what happened in Latin America, some ways you need the US to be concerned with another area like the Middle East, because it's unclear if the pink tide would even have been able to happen if the US hadn't had its whole national security apparatus focused on destroying Iraq and other countries in the Middle East, because they obviously tried to take Chavez out in 2002, which was unsuccessful. But aside from that, there wasn't the effort you're seeing now in Venezuela. There's a real the Empire Strikes Back time now. They've kind of moved their sights over to Latin America, and the Trump administration has talked about taking out Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So I think it's hard to resist, but I think they can do it. But I don't know. I want to sound optimistic, but I'm not really optimistic at the moment, just because if you look at the countries that are still standing up to the United States, they're very, very isolated. Like Venezuela, how can it it's got Colombia on one side, which is a US client state, Brazil now ruled by a fascist, which is a US client state. So it's very, very hard to resist that kind of pressure. And in fact, I don't hold a candle for the governments of China or Russia, but the multipolar world we see now is much, much better, I believe, for progressive movements and progressive governments, because you have space to work between the two superpowers, or three superpowers. Well, actually, Russia isn't even a superpower. It's presented as a superpower, but essentially it's got a GDP is smaller than South Korea. But China and Russia actually giving support to the Venezuelans has allowed them to hold on as long as they have. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the march of neoliberalism was able to happen in a way that it did because there was no other pole that you could organize around. Cuba being another example. If Cuba hadn't had the Soviet Union to organize around, it would have been destroyed. The Castro government would have been destroyed a long, long time before. So I think it's very hard in a regional sense. It seems like they're picking each government off, but the fact that we have China and Russia who seem to be dedicated to helping Venezuela at this time, it may not last like that. That does give me some hope that they'll be able to resist the subversion that's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite a hopeful time in the 2000s for Latin America. I mean, you talked about giving refuge to Assange, but I know Uruguay, for instance, offered to rehome all the Guantanamo Bay survivors, and just the sort of strength through unity was their code word, with all these leftist governments banding together and trying to form a sort of international coalition based on solidarity. I mean, one thing that's really interesting I found was that by 2011, pretty much every South American country, bar Colombia, had recognized Palestine as a state, for instance, which just would not have happened. Rafael Correa, for instance, came into power in Ecuador and immediately started improving the general lives of people with incredible social services. But obviously, now we've got Lenin Moreno coming on and trying to really unpick it. In fact, your old newspaper, the Financial Times, said that he was unpicking Ecuador's left-wing legacy. What's interesting, though, is that even though Correa is out of power now and Lenin has taken over, he's still as vigorous in his support for Assange. So, I mean, I've got a tweet from you. He was publicly apologizing to Julian Assange's mother. He said, "Christine, I do not know what to tell you. I only ask for forgiveness from me and my people. A traitor and corrupt person like Moreno does not represent us. I promise not to rest until I see him in jail where he deserves to be. I mean, that's just incredible, the sort of power behind that. But now, as we're recording, as you said, there's been a lot of governments being picked off one by one, and as we're recording, a not too dissimilar event is occurring in Venezuela as we speak, where Washington-backed, Washington-trained, and self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, is attempting to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro. Is this a case of the empire striking back? And it seems to be an example of what you called enforcement in your book.
It's definitely a case of the empire striking back. And I think it's very conscious on the part of the Trump administration that they're refocusing their energies on Latin America, which got out of line during the war on terror years because the focus was on the Middle East. I think Venezuela case is a bit more promising than what was happening during the Cold War, because it seems that there was this big debate in Chile in 1973 because Allende believed in peaceful road to socialism, and he refused to arm the people, even in the face of the forces that were ranged against him. And I know in the lead up to the September 11th coup, there were many groups that wanted to be armed by Allende, and he refused. And I think that, personally, I believe that's a mistake, because the empire only understands one thing, and that's force. And you have to I believe you have to arm the people. But in fact, in Venezuela, they have got these citizen militias now, and they've armed collectivos, which can defend the revolution and defend democracy and the constitution if they need to. So I think, I think it would be an absolute disaster if the US did invade, but I don't think that they would have any kind of easy victory, because they would. The other thing that's happened with Venezuela is a lot of them are fed endless propaganda, and they believe their own propaganda. So I assume they thought this was going to be a cakewalk, and they could get Maduro out, because if you watch Fox News or CNN or anyone, this is a country that's in the biggest crisis there's ever been in the whole world, and yet every time they try and launch Q, it's like 1,000 jokers on a highway trying to take a base, and nothing ever happens. And they get all the headlines, but nothing ever happens because it's bullshit. They have a massive social base of Chavistas, whatever you think of them. They're hugely popular amongst a certain part of the population. So if you invade a country in that kind of context, you'd have millions of people defending their country, their constitution, and you'd have these. It would just be a complete disaster. So I think the Venezuela's case is very interesting. I think it's quite telling that he's held on this long, and probably the longer he holds on, the harder it will be for the US to do anything without intervening militarily. Whether they'd even be able to install someone like they did in Iraq of their choosing is questionable as well. But then, as Maduro said the other day, this is the most deranged US administration possibly in history. So who knows what's going to happen? Everything we know is out the window. I always thought when the Trump administration came in that he'd have a war, but I always thought it would be Iran. It completely threw me.
It might be there too. I mean, yeah, let's not rule it out.
I know 1 week it's Iran and 1 week it's Venezuela, so you never know. But I just thought
North Korea could be back any day now too, because Bolton's sabotaging that. So I mean, it looks like they're trying to start wars.
Venezuela, I always thought, but just in terms of demonizing, I always thought Iran would be easier to demonize. But yeah, actually, Maduro's been demonized in exactly the same way as the Iranian government has. It's obviously more democratic Venezuela. They're presented in exactly the same way, so the demonization thing hasn't been a problem. But I think that Venezuela is the one they always wanted as well, because I talked about Evo Morales, and Bolivia is an interesting case. I think it's the purest, most inspiring case in Latin America, but they didn't have the forces ranged against it that Venezuela has.
They don't have the oil.
Exactly.
Right?
No, it's a small population. It's landlocked. It has lithium. But essentially, the US doesn't give that much of a shit about Bolivia. Whereas, of course, Venezuela's got the largest proven oil reserves in the world. That's the one they've always cared about. So the subversion has been heavier there. And of course, in reaction to that, the government's had to become coarsened slightly. And there's no doubt about it. And in fact, when I was in Venezuela, I was talking to people about what happened in Venezuela. And apparently, the 1999 to 2002 Chavez period was much more liberal than what happened subsequently, because in 2002 he realized that no, actually we can't be very liberal when we have these kind of forces ranged against us, because we'll just be picked off and killed or overthrown. So I think there is this thing of, obviously you want to have a nice, open, democratic society, but when you have the most powerful country in the history of the world with the largest military basically wanting to overthrow you, you have to make some compromises on that stuff. And obviously that's going to get you all the bad press write-ups. But I think Bolivia's managed to kind of escape having to make those really difficult decisions, because the level of subversion hasn't been as large as in Venezuela.
I think that was really interesting about Bolivia too, is that, for example, we had Bolton come out and he made this troika of tyranny, sort of like this axis of evil for Latin America exclusively, but somehow Bolivia was left off of that list. He included Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, but for some reason he just decided not to include Bolivia, which I think is pretty interesting. In my opinion, as you mentioned, Bolivia has lithium and minerals, a mineral wealth that the U.S. may be interested in, but I also think, that the so-called lithium triangle on which Bolivia sits, it's also shared to a big extent by Chile and Argentina. So I think, from the perspective of international corporations, they may think they can, get the lithium that way, and I think that may be part of why Bolivia has been ignored. Anyway, so as someone, as yourself, who has had, extensive experience in reporting in Latin America, do you have any thoughts on the humanitarian crisis and the mainstream, or the lack of, of mainstream media coverage of the humanitarian crisis in Colombia, which borders Venezuela, and has, over the years produced significantly more refugees than Venezuela's current economic crisis? Do you have any thoughts about the various crises that are currently showing themselves in Colombia, and maybe your thoughts about why that hasn't received anywhere near the amount of coverage that Venezuela's own crises have received?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a really good case study, the comparison between Venezuela and Colombia and how it's presented, because in Colombia, all the good news is reported and none of the bad news. And in Venezuela, all the bad news is reported and none of the good news. And that's basically just been the case for the whole time that since Chavez came into power. And I've been to Venezuela, but I went to Colombia recently to look into the case of Chiquita, and the historical case where they'd been funding paramilitaries to pick off and kill trade unionists and other dissidents. And I was shocked by the situation there, because even though I'd like to think that I'm quite resistant to the propaganda that is put out about US client states, the level of fear and violence that there is in Colombia is incredible. I was in Medellin.
It's mind-boggling. Yeah,
I was in Medellin, and I was interviewing a woman whose family had all been killed by paramilitaries linked to Chiquita. And she wouldn't even say Uribe's name. She said, "I'm too scared to say his name." And I was like,
"Wow, he sounds like Voldemort."
Yeah. Well, for our listeners that don't know, I'm assuming you're talking about former Colombian president.
Sorry.
He is alleged to have been head of the AUC paramilitary group before he was president, according to former members of that paramilitary group. And they were the ones, this paramilitary group, they were allegedly, most likely hired by Chiquita.
Well, no, actually, the Chiquita case is one of the more interesting ones, because the Chiquita have actually admitted giving millions of dollars. So the case is actually, it's proven. It's important, because nearly all the other cases, it's been very hard to prove. But there's actually a court case in the US now of different people who were linked to Chiquita and paramilitary. But anyway, so the situation in Colombia is the people are much more fearful, much more scared. There was much more impunity for corporate linked paramilitaries and right-wing paramilitaries to kill and carry out all sorts of human rights abuses. It's not surprising. I mean, that's how the world works. Basically, you'll get a good write-up in the Western media if you create good investment conditions in your country for Western capital. It's a simple fact. Venezuela made things hard for Western investors, so they get monstered in the media. Colombia, while they they'll lend their paramilitaries to the corporations to kill anyone who doesn't like their projects. That's nice. Okay, we like that. So secondly, they've got all sorts of resources that the Western companies want. So of course it's going to be the sort of and the other thing is that it's presented now as this tourist attraction. I was in Medellin, which is meant to be like, it's presented as a new urban center or something. And if you walk around Medellin, there's like little pockets which are very rich. But then we went to areas where basically people, like, they were down and outs shooting up heroin in the streets and all sorts of things. It was so divorced from the presentation you're given in the media. And if you actually look into the people that are being killed in Colombia, literally every week, if you go to certain sources, you'll see that people who are opposed to different projects are getting killed by paramilitaries and corporate. It's literally every week, and no one knows their names. Go on, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Well, I was just going to say what's interesting here is that the current president of Colombia, who has only gotten, in my opinion, from what I've seen anyway, positive press in the mainstream international media, Ivan Duque, he's actually the political protege of Alvaro Uribe. And since he came to power, he's just been, well, no one knows if he's actually involved, right? But the paramilitaries have been, the right-wing ones anyway, have been a lot more active in going after activists, indigenous activists, and social leaders of social movements and things like that, even more than it was under Juan Manuel Santos, who was not exactly easy, he's right-wing as well. So I think that's pretty significant. And speaking of sort of this rebranding of Colombia, sort of like as a tourist place, I think it's kind of interesting because, for example, you have the Guajira Peninsula. That's often been sort of described as a tourist attraction because it's sort of linked to one of Colombia's most famous authors, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? But actually, I'm talking about these predatory capitalist interests in Colombia. The river that feeds that region where Colombia's largest indigenous group lives, the Wayu people, was entirely diverted a few years ago to be given to South America's largest coal mine.
Cerrejón.
Yeah, the Cerrejón coal mine. Are you aware of that situation? Would you like to talk about it? I think it really deserves a lot more awareness than it's been given.
Well, there's a lot of, I've just been working on mining in Latin America, and there's a lot of issues, obviously, in Colombia, but also in the whole region about, because the other thing you see with these governments that, the right-wing governments, they basically act as conduits for multinationals. So they don't, and everyone was talking to on the ground I was saying, well, have you got any protection from the state? And none of them see the state as an ally. I mean, it's not surprising, but it is in political theory. You'd imagine that a state which is set up to represent the people would maybe represent them, but in fact, what they are, they're just essentially representatives of foreign capital. So in the case of Cerrejón, there's all sorts of awful murders and environmental damage that has just been completely ignored. And also the other thing is that Cerrejón's going to run out soon, and they're going to be left with just a devastated economy, and there's no laws at all in place that companies have any obligation to a community or an area once they leave. So you just leave a wasteland, an environmental wasteland, and these indigenous people are completely ignored. The other element of the Colombia situation is the racism involved. It's essentially a white supremacist sort of regime in terms of the elite is all concentrated in the white community. And that's one of the interesting things about Venezuela that's not talked about. And Greg Pallas has talked about that. It's a bit that's essentially is the racial component. If you look at images of the Chavista rallies, they're all very diverse, high levels of high representation of black communities, whereas the Guaido opposition stuff is just all white. And that's typical of Latin America. And that's another reason why Venezuela has to be disciplined, because they've enfranchised whole sections of society which should just be marginalized and cut out pretty much since the Spanish arrived.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for 500 years, I mean, the country of Venezuela and frankly, most of Latin America were set up as slave plantations to grow primary crops like coffee or sugar or bananas or mining or what have you. And it worked how, small numbers of Iberians from Spain and Portugal would come over and enslave the indigenous population or also bring over large numbers of Africans. So you had this situation where there's a small white elite at the top and a large black and brown population at the bottom who are their slaves. But even after independence and the end of formal slavery, the economic system didn't really change. I mean, that's basically how it still works to this day. And so that's why you get the great Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano saying, like, in Latin America, the black are mostly poor and the poor are mostly black. But we don't really see that because there's a great stat that most Americans don't have a passport. And, frankly, it's not that much better for Europeans. And that means that most people don't have any real, actual empirical experience of other countries in the outside world, which means our entire idea of other countries comes mediated through the media, doesn't it? And the media who are they? They're just, a very small amount of corporations who have their own interests. And there's not even very many reporters doing foreign reporting anymore. So even the entire Latin American continent, there's probably just a few dozen Western journalists producing pretty much all we see, whether it's CNN or Fox or Washington Post or BBC or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And essentially, the indigenous communities, especially in Central America, where I spent some time, it's essentially an apartheid situation. There's not much different. I lived in Mexico for a year and traveled quite a lot in Chiapas, where there's biggest indigenous population, and they essentially live a completely parallel existence to the rest of society. They don't own any land that's coveted at all. They don't use the legal institutions. They're basically at the mercy of the Mexican military, and any time the Mexican state decides a corporation wants a bit of land, and they get it. Like, they have absolutely no power at all. And it cuts across ideological boundaries as well, because a lot of the AMLO, who's just come in as the Mexican president, first left-wing president for many, many decades. And he's actually already got quite a lot of stick for not doing much for indigenous communities and it not being an issue at all. And originally, when he was standing in 2006, the Zapatistas refused to, or actually called for no one to vote. They went on a big march and said no one should vote in the elections, and because they didn't believe that AMLO, who is left wing, but they thought he didn't have enough policies which were pro-indigenous. And I think that is kind of true. Even the left wing leaders, there's Correa being a good example as well. He did it environmentally and in terms of the impact on indigenous communities. He did a lot of bad stuff, and this is a kind of this kind of apartheid, implicit racism in the system, which is, as you say, goes back 500 years, is so deeply embedded. It's reflected across the political spectrum. The one place where that doesn't happen is Bolivia, because they've got their first indigenous president under Evo Morales. But I think people don't realize, as you say, because they get all their information mediated by the media, they don't realize that essentially most of Latin America, if you talk about the indigenous communities, is an apartheid state. Most of them, from Mexico, Guatemala, all of them, they're apartheid. I mean, yes, they can vote in elections, but they don't own anything. All the land's owned by the rich white elite. They're all basically peasant communities. And yeah, it's a massive distortion that we're given in the Western media.
Sure. I mean, Whitney, you actually live in South America. Do you have a South American perspective on either Assange or Venezuela? What's the feeling there?
Where are you?
Well, I'm in southern Chile. I'm in, I don't exactly want to say exactly which city I live in, but I live in La Araucanía, which is near Patagonia, I guess you could say. A point I wanted to bring up, though, is that we were talking about travel, how a lot of people in the West don't have passports, don't come here firsthand. As someone I've lived in South America since 2012. At first, I lived in Cusco. And then I lived in a really rural area near Cusco in Peru. I just want to point out, too, that when Westerners actually take the time to try and come here and learn about the culture and see the sites, a lot of times the states set up their tourist destinations so that people from foreign countries only see certain scenarios. They only meet certain kinds of people. They sort of sell the indigenous culture sort of as a tourist selling point. They don't really show you the struggles that indigenous people go through. So, for example, Cusco, has Machu Picchu. It's the biggest tourist destination in South America. But at the same time, you just drive a few hours away. You go to the neighboring region of Apurímac, and there is where almost all the mines are in Peru. And the way they repress indigenous communities there is just insanely brutal and gets no coverage. One of the small towns that I lived nearby, they would just take indigenous people that complained. They would put trash bags over their heads and push them off cliffs in the Andes, just like regular people that resisted. Indigenous communities would go and light mining barracks on fire to try and kick them out, and then Peru would send in the military. I mean, it's just really insane, the kind of stuff that goes on there. It doesn't get any coverage. So even if people go and they try and visit, they don't, those sort of struggles are hidden from them. And that's even true in Chile too. I live in a really touristic area, and there's the indigenous people here, the Mapuche, and they are also subjected to what you mentioned, sort of this apartheid system. They live on reservations, not unlike the North American system, and they're regularly repressed by the police. Actually, Sebastián Piñera, who's the Chilean president, he made this whole new federal police force to go after the Mapuche that's called Jungle Command, because they were trained in the jungles of Colombia. And they go to these, the Mapuche communities. They go into schools full of kids with tear gas, with tanks, and it's insane. But if people come here, like the town where I live, for example, they just go into like the indigenous, huts, and they eat the traditional food, and they see the women in their traditional clothes, and that's all they let people see. You know what I mean? So I think even if you do make the point to travel here, there's a responsibility of the state and the tourist communities and the tourism sort of culture to sell you a certain narrative too. So it's kind of hard to get, this information out. It needs to get out, honestly, because a lot of these issues that we're talking about, as you mentioned, have been going on for centuries and really need some light shown on them.
Yeah, I was just in Chile actually and had a very similar experience because I was in the north in San Pedro de Atacama.
Ah, right, yeah.
But which is very touristy, but in the middle of
and extremely polluted. I would point out too.
Yeah,
from the mines.
Exactly. It's in the middle of it's in the lithium triangle, but also copper. There's huge copper mines. In fact, the biggest in the world, I think, Escondida is there. But I went to visit a community just outside San Pedro on the edge of the Salar de Atacama, which is about 30 miles outside. And this community were basically saying all their water, which comes from the Salar, is being taken by BHP and 4 lithium companies which operate there. And they have absolutely no recourse to any justice at all, because the government is fully behind. In fact, one of the mining companies is owned by Pinochet's grandson. I mean, it's all totally corrupt. And when you're ranged, as I was saying earlier, on an international stage, it's the same thing. But when you have the power, these kind of powerful forces ranged against you, it's freaking hard to fight, because they were saying, we don't have any money. We can't produce studies which contradict the studies they produce, because the other thing these mining companies do is obviously they got endless amounts of money, so they get environmental consultants to do environmental impact reports. And they showed me one, and it was literally it was like 5,000 pages. And the guy was pointing at it and laughing. He was like, "Do you think we're going to read that?" The guy who was the head of the community. So it's like they just plow all this paid for information into the communities. They have no way to fight back against it. And usually the corporations get their way. And in fact, the Salar down the road from this community, which I went to, had actually completely dried up because all the water had been used for mining.
Talking about media coverage, in the north of Chile, something that's really interesting is that there's been all these positive stories, the international press coming about Chile having all this solar power, this wind power, renewable energy.
Right, yeah.
A big selling point for Chile's government and the international media. But what isn't mentioned almost all of the time is that these are for the mines exclusively. These don't actually help regular people. So, for example, where I live in the south, they're trying to bring mining here. There hasn't been mining before in this region anyway, and they're damming up the rivers. They're trying to install hydroelectric plants, and they're not being used to power any of the towns here. Everyone knows it's for mines that they're going to try and put it in the future. And in the north, the wind power and all of that hasn't really helped anyone at all, but they always report in the media that there's this the surplus of energy, and Chile is going green and leading the way in sustainable development. but it's actually, making a really extractive and destructive industry more sustainable, right? So it's kind of an interesting.
Yeah, Matt, you've actually written quite a lot about that, haven't you, for like The Guardian, or about The Guardian and sustainability?
Yeah, it's a massive issue because it's a major part of modern capitalism is presenting exploitative, extractive projects, but nearly every other type of project as well as somehow socially useful. It's like standard procedure now. You pretty much never get a project which doesn't have some sort of element bolted onto it about how great it is for the local community and blah blah blah. And that is when I started looking into this, because I covered mining for the Financial Times for a while, and it was quite a conscious thing on the part of the mining industry around the 80s, because they had such a bad reputation that it was actually very hard for them. It was getting harder and harder to actually make their projects work around the world. They had what they call a social license, which essentially describes the attitudes towards them from the local community. And they were losing the ability. They were saying, we don't have this social license. So then there's this massive push for corporate social responsibility, CSR propaganda. So they'd talk about, everywhere they went, they decided they'd build a school next door or a hospital, whatever it would be. And usually I went to a diamond mine in Tanzania on a story about CSR, and they built this school. And yes, they built this school, and this is a company called Petra Diamonds. They built this school next door, which had 30 kids in it. But they'd been running this diamond mine. They'd been running this diamond mine for decades and hadn't paid £1 in tax because they said, we've never made a profit. So essentially and this is how the system works. So you deprive the state of the money it's rightfully owed, which is probably millions of dollars, but yet you spend £20,000 to build a school. And then you present that as like charity, you're a wonderful organization. But in fact, your company itself is integral to the depriving that state of any ability to actually do anything useful itself. So you get states that just rely completely on charity from corporations. And then the corporations also use the argument, we bring jobs. 20 people are employed in this mine from the local community. And then you're meant to believe, okay, well, that's fine. And it's fine that you deprive them of millions of dollars of taxation and all their mineral wealth because you built this cheap school and you give 20 people a job. So it's a very well integrated system. It works very well for them. And in fact, it even works well with the communities. As I was saying with Chile, in that case, the communities I interviewed, I would be lying if I said they were all opposed to the mine. A lot of them said, we don't mind the mine because it brings money to us and it brings us jobs. But that's because they can never given an alternative. What they need is an alternative where a state is incentivizing socially useful, environmentally positive industries which the state can support in the local area, but it's either nothing or mine or multinational mining.
Right. I mean? Well, I think there's a lot of cities in the north of Chile that are just so used to the mine, and they've just developed all their other industries around mining that they can't really even conceive of. A lot of people there can't even conceive of any sort of alternative, even though like in cities like Antofagasta that are like really big mining areas. Their tap water has so much arsenic they can't drink out of it. Some people can't even bathe in their water. They have to bust it all in. Or the air is full of toxic stuff and they get sick from breathing it, but they're like, no, but we need the money sort of thing. It's just, there's a lot of these hidden costs that even people that live there just have accustomed themselves to living with these sort of conditions, and they just don't see any other alternative than what they're used to. And of course, Chilean media, which is dominated by either, the state TVN, or, CNN, they don't really cover these issues either, and I would argue that Chile's CNN might actually even be worse than the US version.
Wow, that's quite a claim.
Yeah, well, it's at least on the same bar. I don't know. I've seen a lot of really bizarre reports where they'll like, so I was watching one the other day where they were talking about Ortega's government in Nicaragua, and they had some guy on who'd been accused of bias and sort of outed as sort of, this journalist was found to be being funded by people that wanted Ortega ousted and was also taking U.S. money and was linked with some sort of U.S. group. But the guy, the supposed journalist interviewing him on CNN before, without even like mentioning that he was like, anyone that wants to accuse this guy of being biased, they're wrong, and just like went on the spiel that I don't think I have even seen that kind of level of like extreme propaganda even on US CNN. It was just like really shocking to me.
Yeah. The media in the US, even the local media in Latin America, is just freaking awful. It's so bad. It's usually like, I remember in Honduras has 2 newspapers that are owned by 2 oligarchs, and I've just never read anything as bad as that. And that's literally, there's no alternative means of getting information, which is a major part of the problem.
Yeah, that's actually really common from what I understand. Like in Chile, for example, there's a newspaper that's owned by the Edwards family. And of course, Augustine Edwards he's dead now, but he was like this big oligarch. And he's actually one of the guys that went to DC while Allende was president and asked for him to be overthrown and replaced with Pinochet.
Yeah. Not surprising. Yeah.
And of course, the media inside Venezuela is pretty much the same as well, where it's controlled by oligarchs and pushing for a coup. And that's what we're seeing just now. I mean, actually, if the US does try to push for military intervention in Venezuela, what sort of implications do you see for the country and for Latin America as a whole?
It would be an absolute disaster. As I said earlier, that makes me think they won't do it, but then who knows with this administration? Just because I think they misunderstand, or if they do it, they'll be misunderstanding the social base that the Chavista government has. I mean, they've had 20 years of, I mean, obviously a large part of the population don't like them, but a large part massively support them, and because they're aware that they've been enfranchised in a way they never have been before, and they don't want to see that reversed. So you'd have a massive drawn out. If they did, it could be an Iraq situation where they could invade with massive force and topple the government quickly, but then you'd have millions of people that were still representing the Chavistas that would go underground and then fight a civil war. And then that would spread out to the whole region. It would be an absolute disaster. I don't think they'll do it, but as I say, who knows? I mean, what do you guys think?
Well, I personally think, for example, a lot of the concerns, at least within Latin America, are about how many refugees there are right now from Venezuela. And I think any sort of military intervention is just going to see that just increase by a significant degree. So, for example, like in Chile's most recent election, it was a big issue how many refugees were coming from Venezuela. And it's also been an issue in Colombia, Colombian politics as well, and several other countries. So, I mean, And that's just because of, this what is largely an economic crisis in Venezuela, right? So just imagine if it becomes an armed conflict on top of that. I mean, it's just going to create a huge refugee crisis. And also here in Chile, for example, you're having a lot of refugees because of the bans on immigrants in the United States. You're sort of seeing a lot of Latin American countries flooded with people from Haiti, for example, here as well. And so I think it would just... at least in that sense, create a really big refugee crisis. And we could even see sort of an increase in these so-called, caravans that are mostly from Honduras right now, but I think we could see some of that blowback in the U.S. But, Trump has shown himself to really sort of try and take advantage of that for domestic politics about militarizing the border and whatnot. So he may actually want that as sort of a way to pitch himself in 2020, as sick as that sounds. I could really see his administration trying to capitalize on that. But, the scary thing is the brinkmanship here with the Trump administration. You have people like Bolton, and Trump doesn't like to lose, right? And then you have just total maniacs like Bolton as his national security advisor. So,
go on, sorry.
Oh, that was it. Sorry.
I was going to say that the history, or in modern history of the US and South America, has been mainly to get their way through in using local proxies and internal subversion, and they've done that pretty successfully. So I think that I imagine they thought they'd have better luck in Venezuela than they've had so far. But I would have thought that's their preference. I mean, when was the last time the US actually militarily invaded a South American country?
Directly?
Well, I was thinking maybe Grenada and Haiti would be the ones that I was thinking.
Yeah, but that's Caribbean though, isn't it?
That's technically the Caribbean.
Sure.
Well, in terms of like a direct military invasion, I don't know.
We might be
Honestly,
talking about Nicaragua in like well before World War II.
I think that's going to be
Exactly.
like the proxy stuff mainly, but that didn't even involve U.S. I mean, well, none of this really involved U.S. troops, but there has been like U.S. involvement, like in 2009 in Honduras. You know, that was really obviously orchestrated by the U.S. and was even admitted by the Hillary Clinton-led State Department, right? So I would say that to be, you know, probably the most recent one with direct U.S. involvement. But I mean, even sort of those covert diplomatic coups that we saw happen in Brazil, in Paraguay, and places like that after 2009, I think there were allegations of U.S. involvement there, but it wasn't as obvious as it was in the 2009 Honduras situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, if we look back historically, the US tends not to attack countries unless they're pretty much defenseless. Another thing that makes me hopeful for that there won't be an invasion is that I don't know if you saw, but there was these Russian pranksters who pretended to be Swiss bankers and called up Elliot Abrams. And it was a pretty funny chat they had. But they said that they had audio of him saying that they are not planning to invade Venezuela, and this is just a sort of show of strength. Unfortunately, they haven't released that clip, so I can't really be verified about it. But I have to say that, yeah, I mean, if they did try to invade the country, it's unclear who would actually be doing the fighting, because even though there are millions of people who oppose Maduro, I don't see them actually picking up guns and weapons. The sort of people who are in the streets and actually, you know, attacking police or, you know, fighting with the National Guard, there's actually a very small amount of people doing that. Just, you know, a couple of thousand or something. So it's not clear who would actually be fighting the war on the US's side there, especially because Venezuela has a massive gun problem. There are far more guns in Venezuela than the US. And so we might end up with a situation, like you said, Matt, there'd be a sort of huge underground rebel army, and it would become completely ungovernable.
But they've done that before in the Middle East. That's what scares me, is that it's kind of the same in Afghanistan with Northern Alliance when they took out the Taliban, who had massive social base and still do. But they basically just use special forces, sort of small amounts of special forces, to win certain missions, and basically put the Northern Alliance in the presidential palace, and then they just spent up till now fighting this guerrilla army who just had a massive social base. I don't think they'd be stupid enough to do that in Venezuela, but as you say, that would probably be the most likely scenario, that they'd just blast in, put Guaido in Miraflores, and then just like have this massive guerrilla army just fighting it for however long, because as you say, they're the ones that are armed. But we'll see. Well,
that's quite a worrying note to end on, I think. Is there any hope? No, I was going to say, is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Not really. I mean, one of the things we haven't mentioned is there's maybe a more hopeful note to end on is the democratization of the media, which is quite. I'm trying to understand how in the digital age, the media became much more democratized, but the mainstream media, legacy media, became much more constricted at the same time. Because I would have thought they would have reacted to the democratization and all the different new media that were sprouting up by actually opening themselves up a bit and becoming more ideologically diverse, not being so rigid in establishment. But in fact, it's been the total opposite. If you look at The Guardian from the 80s, it's really radical stuff, and even parts of the 90s. And now it's super, super establishment when it's in the middle of fighting for readers with the most diverse media we've ever had. So it's quite a bizarre thing. But I think eventually the legacy media will lose because they're so antiquated. And I think that you're seeing loads of interesting different media outlets sprouting up all over the world, really. And in the UK particularly, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening with local investigative outlets. So, and I think that that war and that dynamic has to go forward really fast if we're ever going to have a political success. The left is ever going to have political success, because so much rides on the media, because that's how the public consciousness is formed, and it's just fed endless amounts of rubbish. And we all read the media critically, but yet sometimes I'll talk to someone who doesn't, and then I'll just see how powerful it is. So if I've talked to people recently about Jeremy Corbyn, and they all adamant he's an anti-Semite, and of course they are, because every time you switch on the news, there's a new story about him.
Right.
Yeah, but obviously I know that's rubbish, and I know it's a psyops to destroy someone who's a threat to the establishment. But most people don't. Now, we need to get to a situation where we can reach millions and millions of people with the truth and not mediated by establishment corporate talking points. And I think we can get there. And I think that technology has allowed us in a way that we never and ever could before, because the intellectual means of production were owned by oligarchs. And of course, the intellectual means of productions or the platforms are now owned by Silicon Valley, which is probably a coming battle in itself. But I think there's much more avenues for us to for dissidents to work and to get our message out. So, and I think we have to. And we're actually looking into starting some new media stuff as well. So yeah, I think there's exciting things in the offing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you point that out too. That as these more independent outlets have sort of come to prominence or have gotten more readership, and in an online world, right? And the legacy media has sort of tilted even more towards the state than it was before. Yeah. What we're seeing also is sort of the state sort of stepping in through their proxy of like these Silicon Valley companies, right? Like social media, in working to censor. Not just independent media, but also we've seen recently, the accounts of government officials of countries that are being targeted for regime change, like Venezuela recently had several government accounts taken down by Twitter. Several newspapers were taken down by Twitter recently. Instagram took down a bunch of Iranian government officials, things like that. Do you have any comments on social media censorship and maybe solutions that you've thought of, or other people that have thought of for getting around that?
I don't have any particular solutions. I think it's important that everyone discusses it now, because I think it is the coming war. We rely on, as I was saying, the media has been democratized, and there's many ways to get your voice out now. But they all rely on private corporations that have all the problems that come with being a private corporation. And increasingly, you're seeing the freedom that they did previously allowed becoming more and more constricted. So I think every now and then there's these stories that pop up that Telezora is being banned on Facebook or Twitter, that Google has changed their algorithm to lock out anti-war sites and stuff like that. And I think that will happen more and more and more. I guess the only way to combat that is to create new technologies and new platforms that don't have the corporate structure. But how easy that is, I don't know. I'm not a techie, but I think that will happen. And the other thing is there is a certain logic to it itself that means that corporations might be inclined to keep it as democratic as possible. Because, for example, WhatsApp, this is a different issue around security, but it's security from the state. They encrypted their services recently, and that I don't think that was because they had some sort of philosophical awakening. I think that was because they basically realized that platforms like Telegram and Signal were going to take a lot of users, because actually the interface itself isn't that complex. So you can recreate it with an encrypted service. And they realized that a lot of people would move over to the encrypted service unless they encrypted. So I think the more and more that will happen. For example, now Proton Mail, that email account, which is just, you can be stupid and have your email encrypted. Everyone's using Proton Mail. Now, will everyone start using Proton Mail instead of Gmail? Because I say stupid because I was trying to use encrypted emails before, like 5 years ago, and it was freaking hard to do. If you're not like a techie, you have to install all sorts of things and have it wasn't easy. Whereas now Proton Mail does it for you. And maybe Gmail will see that and be like, well, actually, maybe in 5-10 years, everyone's going to be using Proton Mail to try and avoid surveillance by the state. So there might be an incentive for corporations to go that way, but who knows? I don't know. That's one for the sort of the techie lefties to sort out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, mainstream media is certainly attacking alternative media, and that's why you have to support alternative media. You can support us at patreon.com/mintpressnews. All Patreon subscribers will be will be able to access extra bonus clips from our interviews. Matt Kennard, do you have anything else to add? Do you have anywhere to promote? Where can people follow your work?
I don't have anything else to say. Do I have anything to promote? No.
Your excellent book.
Yeah, your excellent book.
Corporate space. We're not selling anything. Yeah, buy my book. Not from Amazon.